Welcome to Astronomy Toronto. I'm your host. My name is Randy Atwood. Astronomy Toronto is seen monthly here on Rogers Cable 10, the first Sunday of the month at 9:30. Well, Canada has sent a man into space, and we're quite active in the space program. And my guest today is the author of a new book, Canada in Space. The author is Lydia Dotto, who is a science writer and has been following the space program for a long time. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful book. Had a chance to go over most of it. Haven't quite finished it yet, but Canada has really been in space for quite a while, hasn't it?
That's right. Actually, 1987 is our 25th anniversary of being in space at all. Our involvement in the manned space program, which is what my book is about, really started officially only about 2 or 3 years ago in 1983. When we selected our first group of astronauts. Prior to that, of course, we did provide the Canadarm for the space shuttle, which was used in manned missions. So I think we have a small but respectable presence in both the unmanned and the manned space program.
Well, the book looks at Marc Garneau's flight, which was in 1984, and a really close in-depth view, because you followed the astronauts. You were pretty well in there with them, talking to them about their experiences.
That's right. I was actually working on a magazine article about the selection of the astronauts in 1983, and it was at that point I had long wanted to do a book on Canada's involvement in the space program, and the selection of the astronauts struck me as being the right time to suggest that the public interest was quite high. So I was able to follow their selection, and when Marc was chosen to fly a mission in October of '84, which was sooner than anybody had expected, I had the opportunity to tag along during his training program, and I was interviewing all 6 of them on a fairly regular basis at that time.
Well, the culmination of the training was very early, one October 1984 morning, when you and I both experienced the launch down at the Kennedy Space Center. The first slide that we have is a picture that you took just a few seconds after the launch, which is an incredible sight.
That's right. It was a dawn launch, so the sun was just on the verge of coming up, and as you well know, the shuttle lights up the entire sky. It essentially transforms the night into day. There was a low cloud deck, which was why we have this brilliant yellow white light. Mm-hmm. This slide shows what happens when they got above the cloud deck. This was taken from one of the chase planes. It takes only about 8.5 minutes for the shuttle to get into orbit. So it's a bit of a wild ride, but they get up there pretty fast.
And it's so loud, and you're waiting for such a long period of time, and essentially it's gone in just a few minutes, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. There is a moment, I think everybody who experiences the launch in real life, where you can feel everybody trying to lift it off the ground, sort of physically themselves. It's quite an emotional experience, because the ground shakes, your body shakes, and as the shuttle turns, it does a turn as it goes out over the ocean, and you're getting these pressure waves coming back, pounding you. It's actually a physical experience.
You said you had a little bit of trouble holding the camera to take that.
Well, I was amazed that the picture turned out, because everything is shaking at that point.
Let's take a look at the next shot, which is a portrait of our Canadian astronauts.
That's right. This is actually, no, this is the crew of 41G, which is Marc's mission, and he's on the upper right-hand corner there. He was with Bob Crippen, who's standing next to him in the middle of the upper level, who is the most experienced shuttle pilot. That was his 3rd mission, and I think he has flown 4. This was also the first crew that had 2 women astronauts.
That's right.
This shows Marc. He's actually having a bit of a lunch break there on the mid-deck, which is the lower deck of the shuttle. They have to confine liquids. Solid foods you can eat, ordinarily, as you do on Earth, but liquids have to be confined, because taking care of anything fluid in 0G is a real problem. You also notice, I'm sorry, on that slide there was a little computer that was attached to the wall. You have to attach everything down with Velcro, otherwise it'll just go floating off.
There has been where you put something down and go back to it a little while, it's gone.
It's
floated
gone.
Off somewhere.
Yeah, on the other hand, astronauts have said that they get used to being able to just let go of things. If you need 3 hands for something and you're holding something, you can just let go. And when they come back to Earth sometimes, they're used to being able to do that. And there was one story of an astronaut about a couple of days after he got back who had a glass in his hand, and he just let it go. Was rather shocked and amazed when it fell down to the ground, because he'd gotten quite used to having 0G.
That one picture we had of Garneau there with an experiment and a camera. Let's get back to that slide. And
He had a number of experiments that he had to do. One of them involved taking photography of sunrises and sunsets, and so he had this special camera mounted at the window. Getting window space on the shuttle is very difficult. You're always having to elbow somebody else out because there's a lot of requirement. The other thing is that in order for him to take the pictures that he needed to take, the shuttle had to be pointed in the right direction, and that wasn't always easy because sometimes there might be something else they had to do that required the shuttle to be pointed, say, toward the Earth or away from the Earth, or toward the Moon, and so negotiating the position of the shuttle so he could take his pictures was not a trivial task. This is a picture of Roberta Bondar, who is also one of the Canadian astronauts, and the other ones on the morning of the launch, their responsibility was helping out the media. And here she's talking to Eve Savory of CBC television. All of them had responsibilities with various radio and TV and print media as well.
Okay, now before the astronauts were selected, we had to be looking at how are we going to select our first Canadian astronaut? Are we going to choose test pilots like the Americans did, or what was the criteria for choosing the first one?
Well, it was not test pilots, because the Canadian astronauts, although we call them astronauts, NASA doesn't call them astronauts, they call them payload specialists, and that is one of three categories. There's the test pilot, or the pilot astronauts who fly the shuttle, the mission specialists, which are, again, NASA employees, full-time career astronauts who do things like do the spacewalks, run the Canadarm, make sure that all the equipment is operating. Then there are the payload specialists who are not NASA employees. They are employees of their country, or a company, private company can send somebody up. And they go up there to do a specific job, a scientific task, or a technological experiment, or an industrial experiment.
So it's a one-shot mission for them. They get their payload ready, they go up and do it, and then
that's right. Now, the thing is that is what a payload specialist is defined by NASA as. We, in fact, Canada, in fact, was choosing an astronaut corps. Although at the time that we selected our 6 astronauts, there was only 2 missions committed. There was a very clear intent that these people were going to be flying more than the 2 missions. They were looking ahead at that time to a future for Canada in space. So in fact, they are an astronaut corps, and they see themselves as career astronauts who want to fly many missions. I think we did have a picture of the 6 that were selected. They had 4,400 applications.
Ooh.
And
I applied. Did you apply?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
I think everybody did. These are the 6 that were finally selected. And how do you pick 6 out of 4,400 people? They were looking broadly for people in 2 areas of scientific expertise. One was the physiology medical area, because we've done a lot of work on space physiology. The other is in the area of engineering, because we've developed the Canadarm, and we're developing advanced robotic systems and advanced machine vision systems for the arm. So those are the 2 broad categories that they wanted. Beyond that, they wanted people who were articulate, people who would be comfortable in dealing with the media and the public, because explaining the space program to the public was a very important part of their function, and that was clearly indicated right at the time of selection. And so they had to do things like they had to give talks to the selection committee on various aspects of the space program. They have, although few of them, with one exception, Ken Money, who'd been involved with the space program for 25 years and had previous involvement with the media. None of them had much involvement with the media, and it came, I think, as an eye-opener for them, but they became very skilled.
Let's take a look at the next shot, which shows one of our astronauts, Roberta Bondar, in a device called the PAM.
A PAM. That's called the Precision Angular Mover, and it's a spinning device. We've all heard about the problems that astronauts have had with motion sickness, and we're still trying to understand why this happens. They think it's similar to motion sickness on Earth. They're trying to develop ways of predicting who will get motion sick in space, and the PAM is a device that is used to measure the susceptibility of a subject. And what they do is they tumble them inside this thing, heels over head, at a certain rotation rate for up to 10 minutes, or until you cry uncle, whichever comes first. And this is a way of testing how susceptible you are to motion sickness. Unfortunately, they have not found any device that on Earth that actually predicts. Now, this is an interesting thing. This shows the only way that you can get real zero gravity on Earth is by flying a plane in a roller coaster climb and dive. And as you go over the top, you get about 30 seconds, about half a minute of zero gravity. And this shows the plane here in its climb. Just as you get to the top, you get 0G. And if we can see the next picture, this gives you an idea. You can see the hair floating up inside the plane. You can actually maintain yourself in an upright position if you want. What she's doing there is very interesting. She's testing out a hand wash basin because you can't have water floating around loose in zero gravity. And this was one of the things that they needed to test in real gravity, because when you get up there, keeping the place clean is very, very important. And so that was one device that they had to test in real zero G.
Plus, anyone who's spilled water on their stereo set knows that electronics don't like water too much.
Well, this is true, but cleaning up anything, that fluid in zero G, is much more difficult than on Earth. This is a picture of Bob Thirsk, who is one of our astronauts, and he's on the KC-135. That's the name of the plane. He's hanging on to the suit that they use for the EVA or the spacewalks. And this is another thing they do on this plane. They test getting into and out of that suit, because that thing weighs about 300 pounds on Earth. And in the 2G that you get when you in the dive in the plane, it weighs 600 pounds. But during the 30 seconds, they practice getting into and out of that suit and going through the airlock. Again, something that they need to have real zero gravity to test.
Now, here's the big surprise. Here's Lydia in the Vomit Comet,
That's
or the
right.
KC-135, and you were actually experienced weightlessness on
That's
this
right.
plane.
That's right.
What was it like?
Well, I loved it. I'm not very susceptible to motion sickness, so I didn't have any problems with motion sickness. And zero gravity is truly an experience that is out of this world. I think the strongest sensation I had, and this has been reported by a number of astronauts, is that you lose the sense of where your body is, where your arms and legs are particularly. When I saw my arms floating up in front of me, it was like they were foreign objects floating in front of my face. I could see them in front of me, but I couldn't feel them floating up. And you feel almost like a disembodied spirit, because you can't, if you close your eyes, you can't tell where your arms and legs are. The other thing, the strongest impression I had, was that you have to learn very quickly how to move in zero gravity, that you don't use the kind of force that you're used to exerting on Earth. If you push yourself off from a wall very strongly as you would on Earth, you'll go shooting across to the other side. That's one reason why the walls are all padded, is to prevent people from getting too many bruised knees.
For the novices who haven't got their space
That's
legs.
right. And it is difficult. The first time I was let loose, I floated up to the roof, and it was great until I realized that I had to get down to the floor, because when the 2G part comes, then you can get seriously crunched
So
if
this
you're
is
not
30 seconds of 0G, 2G. How many times?
The flight lasts about 2.5 to 3 hours, and they do 40 to 50 of these in a row without stopping, no matter who gets sick. And each time, as I say, each time you go over the top, you have this 30 seconds, and then it's 2G on the pullout. So there are people who are okay for the first little while, but then after 10 or 12 of these, it kind of gets old.
Let's take a look at the next slide.
Well, this just proves that zero gravity is an equal opportunity environment. These are two of the U.S. astronauts. As a matter of fact, although this was their first training flight, about a year later they got married.
Oh.
But you don't need the same kind of physical strength in zero gravity that you need on Earth, but you do need stamina. You do need endurance and stamina. Working in that spacesuit is extremely fatiguing, even in zero gravity. And so it's not something for someone who's out of shape.
Right.
Now, this shows experiments that they're doing on Earth. This is in a water tank. If you look carefully, you can see a diver in a mask behind the two spacesuited astronauts. The only way, the KC-135 only gives you 30 seconds, so if you have a 7-hour spacewalk to do a repair on something, it's not going to help you practice what you need to know. So what they do is they put them in the water tank, because buoyancy in water is a very good simulation of the kinds of slow motion movements of your arms and hands and fingers. And this was actually two of the astronauts who were practicing what they were a repair job that they were going to do when they went outside of the spacecraft.
Plus there's a full-scale space shuttle underwater, so
that's right. They have the whole cargo bay is in the tank. They go in with the suits because, of course, if the suit is sealed against vacuum of space, it's sealed against water.
Right.
And they sit there and they practice every single minute of what they have to do in space.
Certainly, astronauts in space has been very important over the last couple of years. The next series of slides will show us two main reasons why it's been important, and that is space rescue or satellite rescue in space. Let's take a look at the series of slides, here, Lydia.
This is what was known as the fly swatter rescue. This was a satellite called LESAT, which came out of the shuttle bay, and it was supposed to start spinning faster, and its antenna was supposed to come up. It didn't happen, and they thought that maybe by pulling up, there was a 6-inch lever on the side of the spacecraft. They thought it was in the off position, and they thought if we can just pull it to the on position, maybe it will work. So what they had to do was construct these two little things called fly swatters. This was a completely unplanned, unrehearsed rescue mission. These little fly swatter things were made out of plastic document covers and metal wires that they found in the spacecraft. and they had to construct these things, and then 2 of the astronauts had to go outside of the spacecraft, unplanned spacewalk, strap them on the Canadarm, and then they moved the Canadarm closer to the thing, and they actually did pull the lever.
Didn't quite work, but...
Well, the problem was that there was more wrong with the satellite than that, but they did actually succeed in doing the job that they were setting out to do.
Astronauts on the end of the Canadarm have, well, it's certainly it's a workstation for astronauts, isn't it?
That's right. When you're trying to do work with both hands in zero gravity, you've got to have your feet anchored. Otherwise, if you're trying to turn a bolt or something, you're going to turn yourself as easily as you're going to turn the bolt. And so you need something that anchors the feet and also someplace to store tools in that. And the Canadarm proved to be a very good workstation for the astronauts.
This was one of the most exciting missions in November 1984, just a month after Mark's mission.
This was a rescue of 2 satellites, Westar and Palapa. They were stranded in useless orbits, and so the insurance companies who had paid off $180 million in claims said, let's pay another $10 million and go and get them. And that's what they did. This series of shots show one of the astronauts heading out with an instrument called the Stinger, which he inserted in the nozzle of the satellite, and essentially drove it home to the satellite, or rather to the shuttle. And once they'd got it near the shuttle, then they had, you can see one on the end of the arm there and the other still hanging on. They were trying to maneuver it by hand into the cargo bay.
Essentially to bring it home.
Bring it home. They were going to latch it down and bring it home and fix it. Now the next picture will show one of the latching mechanisms that they wanted to use was not working. So Joe Allen had to essentially balance this thing, which on Earth weighs 7.5 tons. Balance that for 90 minutes over his head by hand.
Joe Allen's only about 5'4".
That's right, that's right. And it was a difficult job because although the thing is weightless, it's still bulky, it has mass.
So if you get it moving, you've got to stop that mass, and that's
right.
difficult.
And there are a number of times when they were saying from inside the shuttle, be careful, you know, don't hit the side of the cargo bay. And this just shows after they were finished, they were quite pleased with it. If you show the next picture, you see in a sense it was a joking reference, but in fact they did sell at least one of the satellites, and they expect to sell both of them and recoup their investment, the $10 million investment in the rescue mission. So I think it does show that you know, the combination, the partnership between humans and machines has a great versatility in space.
Let's talk about the next major job in space, and that's space station. Where are we now with the American space station, and what's Canada's involvement?
It's been a very difficult negotiation over the last 2 to 3 years, and it's been made more difficult by all of the problems that resulted from the Challenger accident. But basically, Canada, Europe, and Japan have made agreements with NASA to help build the space station. The estimates of its cost at the moment keep going up, but it looks as though the U.S. component of that is going to be on the order of maybe $15 billion. Europe is putting in about 2 to 3, and Japan probably close to 2. Canada's contribution is about $800 million, which is over the next 15 years. That's primarily to build something called the Mobile Servicing System, which is 2 of manipulator arms that are somewhat similar to the Canadarm, but it includes what they call smart manipulators, which is artificial intelligence, expert systems, and advanced robotics. And that's really the reason why Canada wanted to get involved, is to promote the development of that technology in our industry. It's also a way of buying a place on board for Canadians in the future on the space station. By making a contribution to building it, we then earn the right to put our scientists and our astronauts to use the other $20 billion worth of facility and research labs that the other partners are putting in.
Now, one major problem that the Canadian government has to look at is the possible use of the space station for defensive purposes, and some people would rather not Canada be involved with such a space station.
Well, I think most of the international partners and NASA, just about everybody except the Pentagon, wishes that there would be absolutely zero military involvement in the space station. It has always been on the cards right from the beginning, and the partners knew that military-funded research that was within the context of existing international agreements could be done on the space station. Although the Pentagon, when the space station program was first proposed, opposed it. They had no use for it, and they still have not identified any use that they want for it. What has happened is, as a result of the Challenger accident, they're reviewing their options, and they have come out very strongly recently saying, you know, we don't want NASA to enter into any international agreements that will limit our choices, limit our options. And in fact, if they don't agree to this, we should ditch the international partners. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to happen. I think that it's reached the stage now where the president is going to have to say either we're going to go with what the Pentagon wants or we're not. And I think if they go with the Pentagon's position that they can walk on board and do pretty much what they want to do when they want to do it, then I suspect that Canada and Europe and Japan will be out. And in fact, there is some discussion about those three partners trying to get together and building on their existing expertise and going it alone without the United States. However, there are many people in the United States who are equally opposed to the military involvement. And the pundits have been suggesting that probably the United States will come down on the side of a civilian space station for peaceful purposes that will allow the international partners to participate.
Since the Challenger accident, has NASA pulled itself together by now, April 1988, 14
Not really.
months afterwards? They're still in a shambles, aren't they?
They're not really, they're not the NASA we knew and loved yet. Part of the problem has been the continuing technical difficulties in terms of getting the shuttle back on track again. But most of the problems that remain are political. I think that all of this dust-up that has occurred over the military is really indicative of a power struggle. People saw that NASA was weak. And the Pentagon military had always wanted the space mandate. The Air Force, right at the beginning, back in the days of Sputnik, had always felt that space should have been their mandate. And I think that what we're seeing here, a political power struggle that is reflected by the fact that NASA is politically weak at the moment. The other difficulty is that the cost estimates for the space station have gone up. Part of the problem is the $8 billion figure that we've been hearing for so long was never more than a figure that somebody had just pulled out of their hat. It was never a realistic figure. And I think a lot of the engineers knew that it was going to be at least twice that much.
But it shades of the space shuttle, where they said the space shuttle will be $10 billion, it'll pay for itself, and that got it through Congress up to the point where they couldn't turn back. And a lot of congressmen are not going to let the space station go ahead if that's the same story.
Well, it may or may not be the case, but I think that there is a difference in the sense that NASA from the beginning realized that the space shuttle was a transportation system. It was never intended to be all things to everyone. And what the space station is really about is a permanent base. It's really setting up housekeeping in space. And I think that people who take the longer view realize that, we're going through a rocky period right now, and although the money sounds like a lot, in fact, if you look at it in the context of what's being spent in other areas, it's really not an exorbitant amount of money. I mean, even $13 to $15 billion, that's over a 15-year period. When you consider the fact that we're spending over $1 trillion a year on weapons right now, to me, it's not out of keeping with what we're trying to do, which is basically setting up a system, a base in space that will allow us to use that environment to generate a return. And I think, despite what's happened, I think we will see after the turn of the century businesses in space that will start to earn their keep. And I think space will begin to start giving us a return on investment.
Here's a slide of the space station, Lydia, and I guess the space station that we're going to see is going to be a little bit different than this?
Yeah, this one focuses on the Canadian contribution. You can see the arm there, and the little crab-like device on the far side of it is what we call the smart dexterous manipulator. What you can't see very well here is a kind of a box-shaped beam structure, and what they've now done is, instead of what they're planning to do, is do it in two phases. One is a single beam across the middle with these circular modules that you can see, which are the research labs and the living quarters in the middle, and then this one long beam across the center. And then in the second phase, which we're not sure when that would be, but perhaps after the turn of the century, you would construct a very large rectangular box system, which you would have on the top, you would have a whole bunch of sensors that would be looking out toward the universe, telescopes and things like that. And along the bottom, you would have the sensors looking towards Earth. It's unclear at the moment how soon these two phases would be going, but basically I think certainly the intention is to put most of the Canadian system in the first phase. So I think we'll probably see Canada's contribution happening pretty much on the time frame that we'd expected, which is over the next 10 to 15 years.
And what about our two next Canadian astronaut flights, one on space vision and one on space medicine?
Right. Well, we've selected, Steve McLean has been chosen to fly the next mission. He would have actually been flying March of '87. if everything had gone according to plan. We don't really know when he's going to fly. It all depends on when the first flight of the shuttle occurs and how successful that is.
Do we know when that's going to be?
Well,
right now?
NASA has been saying February of '88, but nobody I know believes that. In fact, some people are suggesting that it will be surprising if the shuttle flies at all in '88. If for no other reason than if the first flight gets pushed for technical reasons into the fall of '88, that's the presidential elections in the United States, and there's some suggestion that they won't want to do that in the middle of an election. In any event, I think most people are saying late '88 is the earliest. And if Steve flies, it would certainly, he'd be lucky, I think, to fly within the first year. And again, it depends on how successful the flights are. So I don't think he's going to fly before perhaps late '89. We have a third mission, which is a life sciences mission. Steve, incidentally, will be testing out the space vision system.
That's
which
with
is
the space arm?
That's right. This is intended to provide the Canadarm with a set of eyes, essentially. What it does is a way of tracking and measuring the thing that you're trying to grab, how it's rotating, what its position is, what its speed is relative to the arm. And this is a way of helping the astronauts to control the arm and use it more efficiently and also more safely. So he's going to be testing the prototype on the space shuttle.
The other mission is just basically
life sciences, partly motion sickness, but a whole range of other things. There's a lot of subtle things that happen to the body's central nervous system, and so we're going to be doing a range of life sciences, physiology, medical type experiments. And we haven't, there are 3 of our astronauts who are either physiologists or MDs, and one of those 3 will be selected probably sometime soon to fly that mission.
Super.
But that will be in the 1990s.
Thank you very much, Lydia, for joining us today. We'll look forward to having you back again sometime in Astronomy Toronto.
Thank you.
And Randy Atwood here for Astronomy Toronto. Get out there, Canada in Space. It's a wonderful book by Lydia Dotto. And for Astronomy Toronto, my name is Randy Atwood. We'll see you next time.